In 9 short months, Americans will decide who will return to Congress and who won't. Has your representative, your senator, been doing their job? It's a question we should all be asking. And it's a question we'll ask our panel next as the Centrist begins now. Hello, I'm Mark Harrison. Even an institution known for its governing dysfunction, the 2025 Congress set a near historic low bar for productivity with only 362 votes being cast. And because election years are historically less active than non-election years, 2026 could be even lower. Republicans control the White House, the Senate, and the House. Is this normal when a party controls all three bodies? Is President Trump getting in the way, or is this what he wants? Is the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, strong, weak, or is he simply doing a high wire act to keep his job? To help us shed some light on these and other questions, we've assembled a group of distinguished experts, and they're going to help us begin this discussion and hopefully get you to start talking to other people about it as well. Joining us today are Brian Kalt. He is a professor of law at Michigan State University, where he teaches torts and administrative law and focuses his research on constitutional law, as well as the presidency and other topics. Michael Genovese holds the Loyola Chair of Leadership Studies and is a professor of political science, as well as holding several other titles at the university. He has written over 50 books. His last was in 2022, titled The Modern Presidency. And Mark Caleb Smith, he serves as professor of political science and is the director of political studies at Cedarville University, where he teaches in American politics, constitutional law, and more. Dr. Smith's primary research interest is in the field of religion in American politics. Gentlemen, welcome to the Centrists. I'd like to start with you, Michael. Is the president to blame for this mess, or is Congress to blame? How did we get to this point?
Well, we've become over time a presidential nation. So if you're going to blame someone, it has to be the president. Congress has not been doing its job, and it's not been doing its job for a number of decades. That's not the way it's supposed to be constitutionally, because the Constitution, Article 1, is the Congress, and they have most of the juicy powers that government has. Article 2, the presidency, the presidential power cupboard is a little bit bare. But over time, because of presidents who are grabbing power, because of crises, because of war, because of modernization, Congress has failed to do its job. Presidents have stepped forward. And so we are now very much a presidential nation. Congress could get in the way. It could stop at any time it wants to, but it has failed to do so.
And Mark, do you have anything to add to that? What do you think is causing the problem? Or do you even think there is a problem?
I think there's a significant problem. And I think I agree with Michael for the most part, but this has been a problem that's been brewing for several decades. I mean, it might be convenient to say, well, in the last 10 years, we've seen real problems with executive expansion, but this has been going on for really more than a century now when you get down to it. I think for me, a lot of directions we could go, but for me, I think the most interesting thing is that the impeachment restraint on the president is now essentially a dead letter. I think the founders had this expectation that impeachment would function like the nuclear bomb of checks and balances, and now it's really more of a squirt gun. It's just not going to do very much. Partisanship has overwhelmed impeachment as a reality, and so the president, for all intents and purposes, just isn't all that bound by Congress, at least not at the moment.
You brought it up, so let's go to impeachment. Brian, you have written on the subject. You were actually misconstrued during the last impeachment of one of the Trump administration by certain media and maybe even the defense for President Trump. Can you give me your take on this? I mean, what's going on with impeachment? It's, as Mark just said, it seems like it's just a silly game anymore when it used to be of such importance.
Yeah, well, it used to not happen very often as far as the president was concerned. We went 200 years with only 2 serious impeachment episodes, 3 if you count Nixon, who resigned before he would have been impeached and removed. But in the time since then, we've had multiple, right? Trump, 2 of them, and Clinton I would put in the more modern era where impeachment no longer functions as it used to. What we have now is a futile impeachment as the norm, where it's easier than ever for a House majority to agree to impeach the president. it's harder than ever to get 2/3 in the Senate to agree to convict. And this is because of political polarization. It's not hard if you have the majority in the House to get the majority to vote a certain way, but that 2/3 requirement is impossible to do without convincing significant numbers of members of the president's own party in the Senate to vote to convict. And so we see impeachment in the House as a symbolic measure for the most part. The reality is, because of this partisanship, we won't likely see a successful impeachment and removal unless something happens that's so bad that even the president's own party is willing to admit, well, first, that it happened. We have a two-reality system as much as a two-party system now. But second, that it's the president's fault and that he should pay the ultimate political price for it.
And let's just talk about this politically for a second. Is this not what's happening? The public, the voting public, is beginning to say, oh, it's just impeachment again, and it's either my guy or it's not my guy. Any of you, tell me what you think of the impact on the voter. I see you shaking your head, Mark. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think to circle back on this idea of two realities in our system, our voters are really functioning in their own information silos. And so since they're not getting the kind of information that might be critical of the person that they favor, whether that's on the right or the left, I think it's almost in some ways too much for us to expect them to come to the conclusion that their side has done so much that's wrong. I mean, when I'm looking at all this unfold and I'm trying to get information from every direction, official, unofficial, and come to some sort of judgment, that's just not the information environment that most voters are functioning in. Overwhelmingly, they're getting their news from social media platforms, which are feeding them information, which confirms their biases, either positively or negatively, and you end up with this just sort of rage cycle that we're looking at. And so I agree. I think, would we get something that's so bad that voters on the own side would come to the conclusion that something must be done about it? Maybe we got an inkling of that with the discussion about Greenland, where President Trump was sort of saber rattling and then pulled back. Was he starting to get a feel from Republicans in the Senate and elsewhere that, this might be so far over the line that we would have to do something about it? I just don't know.
Michael, Mark just mentioned Greenland. There's been some talk about whether Congress should get involved in the situation in Minneapolis. Now, I know that's been, in the last couple of days, we're tamping that down a little bit. However, are those situations where Congress should get involved, or is that just between the president and his agencies?
Well, it probably should be in the state, within the state, and not necessarily a federal government issue. And Donald Trump made it into one because he sent Americans to different cities. Why? A show of force, a show of domination. He sent them to my city, to Los Angeles, and there was the great incident where a bunch of ICE folks came in on horseback to a park, and there was nobody in the park. And it was supposed to be a show of strength. Instead, it was a joke in many respects. And so this is not something that Congress necessarily would get involved in. The way it would get involved is if it gives a message to the president. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a number of Republicans going public, really not for necessarily the first time, but the first time in some force, where they're willing to say publicly that the president's gone too far. The headlines are bad, the optics are bad for Republicans, and so Republicans up in 26 want to pull that back. And so while they don't have a literal role to play, they do have a political role to play.
Interesting. Okay. Let's ask the question, the topic of the day, and I want all three of you to chime in on this. And Brian, I'll start with you. Is Congress in fact doing its job, and to a greater degree, is Mike Johnson doing his job as the speaker?
I would say no, based on how the system is supposed to work. But as Michael said at the outset, it hasn't worked this way for some time. This is the culmination of a decades-long trend towards less effective oversight by Congress. They've delegated a lot of their power to the president. No president is going to get elected or even get nominated by saying, I want to hand power away from the presidency back to Congress. I want to get into office to do less than my predecessors did. It's it's hard to see how we reverse this trend. But the reality of the trend is that Congress, which was supposed to function as a co-equal branch and an independent branch, is just one more theater in the same two-party struggle that we see at every level. And we used to have parties that overlapped, right? Southern Democrats were more conservative than New England Republicans. And so there was a center, and we could govern from the center. There would be a consensus, and we can still find consensus on some issues, right? People, if you poll them, they agree on certain things until they become associated with the other side. So I'm not sure that Congress is capable of getting past this problem because, again, they've just become another theater in this highly polarized. There is no center to govern from, and until there is a center, and until there is sort of a consensus against the president or for the president, nothing can get done. Congress will just be shifting like a pendulum between whoever has the majority that term.
Mark, how do we get back to the center? Is it even possible? Have we gone so far into presidential power where there is no turning back?
This is a complicated problem, right? There are lots of factors that go into it. And I want to touch on something that Brian just mentioned and expand on it just a little bit. He kept using the word theater in the sense that it's a front in the battle. I want to use it in a slightly different way. Theater as in the sense of performative legislation as opposed to real legislation. I think it was maybe 6 or 8 years ago, I don't remember for sure, Madison Cawthorn, the young member of Congress, is elected from North Carolina, and he did not hire a legislative director, he hired comms people. In his mind, the job of being a member of Congress was to do communications, to do social media, to sort of use that platform to expand his brand as a member of Congress. Now, members of Congress coming up through the system do not see their jobs as legislating. They see their jobs as appealing to the base, the core of their supporters within their party, to fend off a reelection campaign and not to actually write bills themselves. Now, but I think the truth of it is that's not all their fault. The system has been changed over the last few decades to pull more and more power in Congress into the leadership of Congress. So now when we see a major piece of legislation, we don't see members of Congress hashing this out on committees. We see the speaker, we see the majority leader, we might see the minority leader going to the White House, having high-level conversations. Those 6 or 8 people hash out a bill, and they just throw it in front of the members and say, hey, here you go, vote on this up or down. You got 24, 48, 72 hours, and let's just see how it goes. And so they've restructured the institution so that it really is no longer functioning in this fundamental way that it's supposed to. And I think you're seeing the members of Congress react to those kinds of new shifting incentives that are in front of them.
Michael, where is the spine? Where is the boldness? Where is the leadership in Congress? I mean, it's gotten to the point Marjorie Taylor Greene says, no, I don't agree anymore. I quit. I'm going home. I'm going to take my ball and go home. And it's ridiculous. Senator Flake did the same thing a few years ago. I don't want to play anymore. I go home. Instead of saying, hey, I'm going to fix this problem. I understand being primaried and all that stuff. But who is going to stand up and be bold about this?
Well, I think you have to incentivize good behavior, and we don't do that. In fact, we have disincentives. You get more play if you go with your majority in your party and not fight them and not take them on. And if you take them on, you will be, as so many Republicans now fear, primaried. And so Congress members, their first goal is to get reelected, and if they see a threat to that, they will cower and they will move back. But I also want to pick up on something that Brian said that I think was just right spot on, which is presidents today, when they run, candidates run, they don't run by saying, I want a smaller presidency, I want less power, I want to have more of a balance of power, I want to have a more constitutional system. What they say is that I can do it, I can get the job done. That's not the way it's always been, but it's the way it's been since about 1980. Prior to the 1980s, conservative Republicans had a very clear message about presidential power. Not that it was poison, but that it should be reduced, that we were moving too far in the direction of presidential power. FDR, Harry Truman, and then Lyndon Johnson. And so in the 50s and 60s, Republicans quite often were saying we want a smaller and a more constitutional presidency. That ended in the 1980s. Ed Meese, who was Ronald Reagan's attorney general, and the Federalist Society and the development of what they call the unitary theory all found a way to say to Republicans and conservatives, hey, we can use the big presidency too for our ends. And so what's happened is, and I think Brian didn't specifically say this, but I think he was speaking to this, we're all big presidency parties now.
Brian, let's talk about the Justice Department a little bit. Should we be worried about what is going on at the Justice Department, and what is Congress's responsibility when the DOJ is perceived to be at risk the way it is?
I think what's happening with DOJ right now is of great concern. It points to a constitutional difficulty, though, which is the unitary executive theory that Michael just mentioned. That is, Article 2 of the Constitution says that the executive power is vested in the president. And so the theory then goes that all of the power of the executive branch is supposed to flow through the president. Well, the Department of Justice is a department of the executive branch. The president is ultimately responsible. He decides who to nominate for the attorney general, and he can fire the attorney general. And so presidents constitutionally have tremendous power to control what the DOJ does. In recent decades, though, we had moved away from this notion of presidential control and built up this institutional imperative in the Justice Department towards independence. And this was good for the Justice Department. It was good for the country, because when the Justice Department went into court, the courts, which are still relatively independent, could trust that the Justice Department was not just doing the political bidding of the president. They were engaged in a good faith effort to interpret, to enforce the law. And so they gave extra weight to what the Justice Department would argue when they were in court. So by reasserting the control that the Constitution probably does actually give the president, President Trump has weakened, has squandered, I would say, that capital that the Justice Department had in court, and removes the protection and the credibility that independence gave the Justice Department. It's a very short-sighted approach. I think that a president might be able to do well to run on a platform of saying, I will restore the independence of the Justice Department. And what we saw was President Trump criticizing the Biden Justice Department for coming after him, but I think took the wrong lesson from that. And this goes to a broader problem, I think. Voters and through civic education, people used to understand that we had important neutral principles, things like an independent Justice Department, things like an independent judiciary, things like checks and balances. And now, because of this polarized partisan landscape, people aren't interested in those things. They don't want a restrained president. They want a powerful president on their side. And they don't like it when there's a powerful president on the other side, but they don't see the problem as the president being too powerful. They see it as the president being from the wrong party. So if we could get back to those neutral principles, I think there is some hope to sort of improve the situation.
Mark, how do we do that? How do we get back to that?
You know, as a professor, you often hear people like me say things like, well, we need to improve our civic education in America. And I firmly believe that, but if I'm honest about it, I'm not sure we can come to an agreement on what civic education should look like throughout America to the point where we could really improve it. I hate to be negative, and I'm not cynical, but our cultural conflict, you can't ignore the fact that we have radically different views of reality that exists in our country, and those views underpin these two sets of parties and ideologies we see competing against each other. and coming up with a set of neutral principles. I agree that they exist. I think the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution give us a wealth of those principles that we could use to then teach other people. But then once you think about how that looks in a classroom in Oklahoma versus a classroom in New York versus a classroom in California or South Carolina, this gets to be much, much, much more difficult. And so I think that we need something even more fundamental, perhaps, than education. We need a reacquaintance with the idea of citizenship, a sense that these people that I'm living alongside are actually fellow citizens of mine. They're not political enemies. They're not people that are vermin, not people to be hunted and prosecuted or persecuted. They're actually my neighbors and my fellow citizens who deserve the same rights that I have. But again, and I'm sure maybe all of us would say the same thing. In all of my conversations and interactions with people, I agree with Brian. The sense is that if it's my side that's doing it, I'm going to support it. I'm really not willing to extend the same kind of grace and understanding to the other side, even when it comes to something as fundamental as, say, the First Amendment and the freedom of speech. It's as someone, just to be really candid with you, as someone who sort of came of age on the more conservative side of the spectrum, it grieves me to see my own party, my own past affiliations, being unwilling to extend basic civil liberties when they made their credibility on sort of an originalist approach to the Constitution and sort of a high understanding of what the Bill of Rights would protect. And it's just watching that sort of evaporate has been, it's been quite a bit to watch over the past 10 years. I'll just say that.
How does you enjoy doing research into the religious right and in American politics? How is the president being perceived right now by that constituency?
You know, I think if we look at the empirical data, he still enjoys quite high support amongst conservative Christians throughout the United States of America. I think they look at Donald Trump as someone who fights for their values. They're going to point to the Supreme Court and appointments to the court and the overturning of Roe v. Wade and the Dobbs decision. And they've mostly said, you know, we're going to stand beside this guy regardless. Now, I think you can always paint with too broad of a brush. There is some complexity within relatively conservative Christianity. But I still see the heavy bulk of support being pretty strong from Mr. Trump. And I think you could argue that unless that bulk of support wavers, you're not going to really see a dramatic decrease in his power unless the Republicans just really take a shellacking in the upcoming midterms.
Michael, would you agree? And answer me this question. Is the left a little crazy right now?
I think our politics is generally is crazy. I think the left has gone a little wild and the right's gone a little bit wild because we've become more extreme. And that's a function of a lot of factors, the siloing in terms of media and social media, and gerrymandering. If you look at the voting records in Congress, it used to look like a bell-shaped curve with some on the right, some on the left, and a larger chunk in the middle. Each Congress, it gets flatter and flatter, and now it's a U-shaped curve with a lot of folks on the left, a lot on the right, and virtually no one in the middle, just a handful. You can't govern with that. And so what we need to do is both sides have to remember, I think Mark said citizenship, I'd add to that civility. I think if you can teach those two things, instill in people those two things, half the problem I think will be solved.
Brian, I'm going to ask you a question here about the 25th Amendment because I know you've studied and written about it. Every once in a while we hear that. Is what's going on in Washington, is what's going on in the presidency, is this something that needs to be looked at by Congress?
Well, I think that there is a lot of misunderstanding of the role that the 25th Amendment is supposed to play. And that's actually why I wrote my last book on the Section 4 of the 25th Amendment. I wrote that back in 2019 because I got tired of reading hot takes on Twitter that just totally misunderstood the way it was supposed to work. Believe it or not, they're still, despite my book, they still aren't quite getting it. So the misunderstanding is there's this sense that the 25th Amendment is an alternative way to remove the president when impeachment doesn't work, the president's acting a little nutty, the president's senile. We saw people say it should be used on Biden. the purpose of the 25th Amendment is continuity of power. And if the president is unable to do the job, uh, not just that he's doing a bad job, but that he's actually incapacitated, not able to do the job, then power is supposed to flow immediately and smoothly to the vice president. And we didn't have a procedure for that. The Constitution says the vice president steps in, but we didn't have any procedures. We didn't have any standards for that until the 25th Amendment. So the 25th Amendment says, okay, president, if you're going to be incapacitated, hand over power to the vice president, and then when you're better, you can take it back. And we've seen presidents do that. That's Section 3 of the amendment. We've seen presidents do that when they have to get a colonoscopy or something like that.
Right.
But Section 4 says if the president can't or won't say that he's incapacitated, then the vice president and a majority of the cabinet can step in and say, okay, power transfers to the vice president. And so people look at that and they say, okay, if the president is off his rocker, then they should do that. What that misses is that this was really intended for situations where the president was unable to use Section 3. If he's in a coma and he can't write a letter signing away his power to the vice president, this gives us a way to transfer that power swiftly and certainly to the vice president. But in other times, Section 4 is designed to protect the president because the president can, he's not tossed out of office. Power just transfers provisionally and he can come back and say, I'm just fine. And if they continue to say, no, you're not, then it goes to Congress, but you need 2/3 in the House and 2/3 in the Senate to agree within 21 days that the president is incapacitated. If they don't have that, if you don't have the vice president and a majority of the cabinet and 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate all agreeing that the president has got to go, then he takes his power back. And so it doesn't really function as a sort of a no confidence vote. It's harder to use 25th Amendment Section 4 against a resistant president than impeachment would be. Impeachment, you only need a simple majority in the House. So I don't think that it's likely that the cabinet and the vice president, the people most loyal to President Trump or any president, are going to take a step like that lightly, unless he really is that far gone. And at that point, then okay, maybe we would get 2/3 in the House and 2/3 in the Senate to agree.
Almost frightening to think what it would take for that to happen, given politics today. Gentlemen, we're going to go around the room one last time. I'll start with you, Mark. How do we tell us how the future looks bright?
It's a great question. It's something that I try to focus on and emphasize with my students for sure, especially younger and introductory students as they're processing the world around them. And frankly, those students are what give me some sense of hope and optimism. I could be completely wrong on this, and so I will give that caveat. I do think that we could be witnessing the beginning of a generational shift. I think that we're looking at younger voters in the political system that are eyeing how people my age and older than me are behaving within this political system. And they're just saying, you know what, this thing just isn't working. And so I'm hopeful that maybe in 10, maybe in 20 years, they will begin to think through some pretty significant reforms, whether it is to gerrymandering, which I think Michael mentioned, which I think is a massive problem that we have to deal with, or whether it's something else. I do get a sense that they're frustrated. I think that they're properly frustrated. Not only is Congress not doing its job, I think you could argue the president's doing way too much of a job. And I'm hopeful that maybe they will put some energy into the system, flip those incentives for members of Congress, and maybe you'll start to see some change. But I honestly think that's a generational project. That is not something that's going to be a 5-year or 10-year fix.
Michael, how do we look forward to a brighter future?
I am optimistic, not just because I'm an optimist, but because I believe there is reason to be optimistic. The pendulum swings back and forth, and I'm hopeful that it will swing back in the right direction. I think, and Mark talked about this, our students today, regardless of left or right, Democrat or Republican, so many more of our students today are committed to public service. It is now expected the kids talking around campus, and it's like, what do you do for service? It's not do you do it. And so there's a kind of ethic that's being built into our college students, which is you have an obligation to do for others. That's true on the left and it's true on the right. And I think more than anything else, that could be what takes us through. We are leaving our students, our leaving younger generation with a lot of problems. We did some very good things and we did some less so good things. And soon it'll be their time to take over. I think the orientation towards service has been a magnificent transformation among college students. And I think it is good reason for us to be hopeful.
Excellent. Brian, do you see a bright spot with your law students?
With law students, sure.
Well, any students.
But well, I think one good thing about law students is and lawyers is that we're trained to see both sides of the argument, and that's what we need more of these days. One good thing about the pendulum swinging back and forth, despite the fact that it means nothing really gets done, is it gives me some hope that people can come to understand those neutral principles I was talking about before, where you can say, before you say that the president should be able to do this thing, think about, because eventually the other side is going to have a president in there, think about whether you want the other side's president to have that power. And think in those terms. And hearken back to the last president that they didn't like. Maybe appeal to that notion and get people to understand, once again, the need for those neutral principles. And I also see an increase in people who call themselves independents. Does that mean that they're in the center? I'm not so sure about that. Does it mean that they're disconnected and that they don't like either party, but that they still have some, when push comes to shove, some liberal or conservative leanings? Probably. But what it means is that there is sort of a desire for new leadership, and there's the potential for strong, charismatic leaders to get things done by working with the other side. We see this. We see some moderate governors getting things done, attracting support from the other side. If it can be done at the state level, maybe there's little hope of a third party working, but maybe there's a hope of a return to this idea of governing from the center. We can see it work at the state level. Maybe it can sell at the national level too, and that's my hope.
Short answer is, being a centrist a good thing right now or a bad thing?
Well, a frustrating thing, but ultimately I think if we're going to get out of this mess, it's going to be by moving people back to the center.
Mark, what do you think about that?
I agree. I think that it's a lonely place at the moment in some ways, but it's probably mostly lonely institutionally, not necessarily lonely in terms of the number of people that sort of find themselves there. So what's been interesting is institutions, whether it's higher education, corporations, whatever, tend to be sorting themselves along this dimension, far right, far left. We're going to have to develop more institutions that appeal to bigger chunks of Americans. I don't think a party is going to be that thing necessarily, but even more civic organizations that try to search for that center, I think, could be very effective.
Michael, centrist, good or bad?
It can be good. Some people see it as the mushy middle. It's easier to get people on the right and the left angry and motivated and upset. But for moderates, they tend to be more thoughtful. They tend to be more analytical. They tend not to leap to one side or the other. They tend to rely more on evidence and on reason. And I think those people need to have a voice. They do have it. I mean, I think, as Mark or Brian mentioned, that there are governors. I mean, Governor Andy Beshear of Kentucky is one who plays both sides. He's a centrist, but he gets both sides, gets people working together. And I think when you see that model working, it might become attractive to others because the extremists on both sides have not made it happen. It's not worked.
What a great panel. Gentlemen, thank you so much for coming on today and shedding some light on this topic. And my thanks to all of you who took time to inform yourself by watching. Now go out there, find someone who disagrees with you and sit down over a cup of coffee together and realize we are all much more alike than social media would have us think. I'm Mark Harrison, and I'll see you the next time on The Centrist.